Hey, thanks for sitting down with the Daily Ant. I guess to start off with, would you be able to just introduce yourself and maybe explain a little bit about what you do?
Sure. Well, first, thanks a lot for inviting me to do this. It's really a pleasure. I'm Branden Fitelson, and I'm a professor of philosophy at Northeastern University in Boston. And for the most part, I've been working on issues in logic and epistemology and philosophy of science, so kind of at the intersection of those three things. I guess one theme that goes throughout everything that I've been interested in is probability. So, probability is actually a relatively recent concept. The ancients don't really talk about it very much,
Huh.
and it wasn't really seriously developed until just the last 100 or 2 years, and it really wasn't rigorously developed until the 20th century. So actually a surprisingly recent concept. Almost all of science now makes essential use or depends very heavily on probability because everything involves some kind of statistical inference nowadays.
Right.
And typically probability is what's involved in understanding that. And then, of course, there's probabilities in science itself. So biology and physics, they talk about probability, but in a more theoretical sense. They have their own concepts of probability. So I've been interested in that kind of thing, the foundations of probability, for a long time. And so that's one thing that's common to my research. But I also just am interested in epistemology generally, knowledge and evidence and rationality and all that stuff. So yeah, I'm interested in a lot of things. But those are the main things that I've been thinking about.
Especially I think that's sort of interesting. That so it's like if with probability, what kind of probability like thinking has sort of emerged more in the past 100 or so years. Like I guess you my kind of lay understanding of like the Enlightenment and everything. I guess I would prefer to call it an ant-lightenment, but the like is maybe in like the 1700s or so. And so like so then basically is the idea that like because I associate science with probability so closely. I guess like what sort of promoted the shift or like what are some kind of like differences that emerged when that shift occurred towards more probabilistic thinking as opposed to just kind of just like rational thinking as opposed to probabilistic thinking.
Yeah. Well, the ancients talked a lot about reasoning, but they tended to focus on deductive reasoning. Cases where you're inferring something, and that thing is actually entailed by the premises or whatever you're inferring it from. And that obsession with deduction has been with philosophy from the beginning. And also you see analogous things in epistemology. So epistemologists really, until pretty recently, I mean, so certainly if you take someone like Descartes, who isn't that long ago, Descartes thought that epistemology really had to do with knowledge, but that was like certainty, and it was a kind of infallible notion of knowledge. Some philosophers still like infallible notions of knowledge, and if you have that kind of conception of knowledge, then that's going to push you away from thinking about non-deductive inference if you're interested in inferential knowledge, because, well, even if you know the premises with certainty, if the inference is not deductive, then it's fallible.
Right.
So in general, you can't expect those inferences to preserve knowledge, which is, of course, what you want from an inference. So you want it to preserve knowledge and expand your knowledge. But if you're an infallibilist, you're not going to have that much interest in non-deductive or ampliative reasoning. And so those really go hand in hand. And in science, even in science, it was in astronomy really that statistics was born. People like Gauss and that, but that use of probability still presupposes an underlying determinism. So you think, well, the universe is deterministic. There's no probability in nature. The probabilities, such as they are really just either subjective or they involve some kind of error, some kind of human error, like measurement error.
Or like it's just pretty much just that like because we are in the time we're in, like you can't infer, like you have like certain limits to what you can do, but if you were an all-knowing like God or something, you'd be able to know everything that's going on and everything that will go on just based on whatever the state of the world is in this moment or something like that.
Yeah, that's right. And so either you just think there are measurement errors. So the way statistics got started was people started looking at multiple measurements and they started recognizing that they varied. When you made measurements of the same quantity over and over again, there was variation. And that variation tends to look like a bell-shaped curve around what you think the true value of the parameter is, whether it doesn't matter what it is. It could be weight, it could be the position of a planet, it doesn't matter. And that's really where statistics comes from. It comes from, it's all about a theory of error. So it's just formalizing an error theory. It wasn't until quantum mechanics that people really started taking probability seriously in science, because there it just doesn't look like there's any deterministic explanation of what's happening. And so you look at quantum mechanical phenomena, it just isn't plausible that there's a deterministic explanation. And so then the best explanation is going to be that there's actually probabilities in the world that aren't just a matter of ignorance or error, but they're metaphysical, if you will. They're ontological probabilities, nomological, or some other sort of probabilities. And, once you had that, then probability got to be taken much more seriously. And also it needed to be given a theoretical foundation, which didn't, as I said, happen in the 20s and 30s, really, the 1920s, 1930s. So it's pretty recent stuff. And so nowadays, though, it's ubiquitous. Nowadays, both in science and in epistemology, probability is everywhere. Bayesian approaches to this, that, and the other are all the rage. And one of the reasons that that's happened, one of the reasons that Bayesian methods specifically, which are general probabilistic methods, one of the reasons those have become popular is because computers have become fast enough to actually compute the solutions. And to approximate it. And so a lot of it, again, is just contingent on scientific and technological developments that just obviate, that make it necessary to really take probability seriously and allow you to understand probabilities in a deeper way than.
Like I guess outside of quantum mechanics, I'm sort of wondering. So I study ant evolution. So in terms of so when I think about evolutionary science, and it is interesting that the kind of modern evolutionary science, or Darwinian evolutionary science, kind of roughly originating with Darwin, but it's kind of hard for me to imagine studying doing a field of evolutionary biology without having, or even paleontology, without having some sort of probabilistic thinking in your mind, because you weren't there. You basically have to infer things based on some distribution effectively, even if you haven't thinking about that in terms of in the math of it or whatever. So then do you know of, or if it was the case in prior to or in astronomy, it's not surprising to me that it came out of astronomy because it's similar to evolutionary biology and looking into deep time and those sorts of things. So is that sort of kind of probabilistic thinking of I'm trying to estimate what could have happened in the past, different than what they? I mean, it is different than the actual phenomenon in the world, but in terms of scientific practice, are you saying that was also kind of a modern development? Beyond just simply realizing that the world itself might have some sort of indeterminacy.
Yeah, it absolutely was a modern development. If you look at Darwin doesn't really explicitly talk about probability at all. Darwin talks about adaptation and evolution and evolutionary forces, but it's all very Newtonian.
It's much more directional.
Yeah, it's forces and it's teleological, but probability really isn't made formally part of that theory until I think Fisher comes along, and he put it on a much more solid foundation. But that again is early 20th century, and that's typical of, that's just when probability really seriously comes into the picture as a real theoretically well understood thing, and that's kind of cool. And so one of the things I'm doing pedagogically is, so I teach logic and I've been doing that for a long time. And I've always thought logic it's still taught by philosophers in a way that's very, 1895. It's sort of like, as if deduction is sort of like the most important kind of inference in science, but it's not. I mean, but that is understandable. The people who developed logic seriously, like Frege and Russell and people like that, again, around the turn of the 20th century, those people were interested in formalizing mathematical reasoning. That's what they were interested in. So again, that's a realm in which deductive reasoning dominates.
Right.
And that's fine, and that's great. Except now science is almost exclusively interested in probabilistic inferences.
Right.
And so what I'm doing in my logic course, my intro logic course, which is kind of revolutionary, is I'm doing half the semester on Boolean logic and half the semester on probability calculus. So I teach the students the formal theory of probability, which, like truth functional logic, is decidable, and so it's very well behaved. And there's a very simple algebraic way of understanding it. And I think that's absolutely essential for students to learn probability very early on, since it's basically ubiquitous in science now. And that's something I'm just doing. So eventually I'll write a textbook on this, which will be much different than any other intro formal logic textbook that you've seen. Most of those just are purely deductive. Yeah, they're purely deductive. They're just obsessed with purely deductive reasoning. But that comes from a long history in philosophy of, for various reasons, both epistemological and metaphysical, for dwelling on perfect inference or something like that. Perfect arguments that guarantee the truth of their conclusions. And that's fine. But now it's really time, if philosophers are going to be relevant to educate, pedagogically relevant or relevant at all, they're really going to have to be shifting over to probabilistic thinking, because that's what the scientific world has done.
So it sounds like, I mean, like I think there's kind of like general field, if I understand correctly, it's kind of termed like formal epistemology. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you is if you ever consider, you seem to be open to experimentation with these things, if you ever considered formicid epistemology, which would be the study of knowledge about ants.
Sure. I mean, I'm personally not super interested in ants, but when I lived in California, they were a real problem. But for me personally, but I mean, it's not a thing I've studied personally. But I'm a big tent guy. I think people should study what they want. I think I'd welcome all branches of epistemology.
Sorry, go ahead.
I think formal tools could be relevant to that. I mean, it depends on what aspects of knowledge about ants we're talking about. There's theoretical knowledge about ants, like theoretical biological knowledge about them. There's also empirical, much more phenomenological knowledge you could have about ants. I think probabilistic tools would be relevant to all that stuff. And also traditional epistemology could be relevant too. It depends on the problems that you're interested in. But yeah,
because kind of like one question I kind of had with it was also like like part of it's a little bit tongue in cheek, but I also like am curious about like what especially in fields like yours that sort of very much have a very, very clear direct application to the practice of science. Like at what point it differentiates itself from like mere mycology, like how for like a layperson like me who doesn't is not a philosopher, like how would like formicid epistemology be different from just like mere mycology, the actual like study of ants? How would you describe the difference, if there is one?
That's a really good question, and I think that's a question that's very important for contemporary philosophers to, in their own work, ponder and think about. I think in any project of any type, any intellectual project, there's room on the team for a philosopher. And it's funny. So one time I was talking to, I used to teach at Berkeley, and one of my colleagues there, John Campbell, at the time, was telling him how he was on a big research project with a bunch of scientists, and he was sort of the sole philosopher on the project. And he was trying to think of what to say when the scientists asked him this kind of, like what his role was.
Right.
I can't do his accent. He has this terrific Scottish brogue, but I can't do that. But he said something like, "Well, I'm going to think very hard about the project, and I'm going to try to figure out whether the project makes sense, whether what we're doing makes sense." And so and I think that's right. That's on the right track. So I think of philosophy generally as primarily it's useful for rational reconstruction or rational understanding of what people are doing. So people do all kinds of crazy things and they do all kinds of good things. I think philosophy can be useful for not just for clarifying concepts and things like that. Of course, it's useful for that. But I think it's also useful for giving a rational reconstruction of what it is that we're doing when we're engaged in a particular project, whatever the project may be. I think philosophers are particularly well suited to doing that. And I think that's very useful to have a clear sense and a clear rational reconstruction of what it is that we're doing on a given project.
Well, because I can imagine that can also have like implications for like how you interpret the data that you're getting or how you interpret the results. Or like, you know, like I can see that being something that is both within the kind of the expertise of philosophers and something that actually scientists do not always consider, or maybe consider in a certain kind of way, but not maybe expansively enough. So to address your question more directly now, I think it's a very modern trend, and I think it's a disturbing and unfortunate trend, but it's only a very modern trend that philosophy and science are at all in any way divorced. Right.
So let me give you a couple of examples. Isaac Newton was a philosopher. He was a wonderful philosopher. He wasn't just a philosopher, he was an excellent philosopher, as was Descartes, as was Galileo. Okay, and now you move up in time and you come up to someone like Einstein. Einstein explicitly insisted on studying and talking philosophy with his friends. In fact, his favorite thing to do was to discuss the work of David Hume, who was a noted British empiricist. That was his favorite thing to talk about, was Hume. Why? Well, look at what Einstein, or for that matter Newton, look at what they did. They did many things, but one thing they did was develop a very, very deep understanding of what people before them were doing.
Right. Yeah.
What were they doing intellectually? And I think the reason that they succeeded scientifically, one of the main reasons, was they had a deeper understanding of what it was that their cohort and the people before them in their field were doing. What were they doing?
They could build upon it because they had such a strong understanding. Yeah.
Yes. So Einstein, it was only because he had an incredibly charitable reconstruction of Newtonian physics. It was only because he had the most charitable understanding of it that he could go beyond it. But that's true in general.
Just trying to critique it or do something different, it's actually like having a full understanding of and then realizing how you can extend it or expand it. Yeah.
The best way to improve on anything is to understand it more deeply before you do anything. And that is what philosophy is all about. Philosophy is all about stepping back and thinking hard about the questions that you're asking, where they come from, what the best way to approach them is, and how to understand them.
Yeah.
I think without that, there's no intellectual progress is going to be made beyond a certain point. And I think it's, in a sense, tragic that you hear a lot of modern physicists denigrating philosophy.
Or it's not even restricted to just physics. There's even like E.O. Wilson, the great myrmecologist, always kind of perplexingly comes out with like statements that are bizarrely anti-philosophy. I have great respect for E.O. Wilson and kind of made ants cool again in the 20th century, but in the 21st century. But I remember one of his statements was like, philosophy is a collection of failed theories about how the brain works, I believe, is one of the which is also interesting because he also has a great concern for like ethical things in the world and all these other things that are also like outside of just like epistemology and other sort of things that are also still relevant. Like there's also just like a whole other branches of philosophy that obviously are not restricted to theories about the brain. So kind of it is kind of surprising these people who are otherwise Wilson transformed and created a whole like subfields and stuff within biology, which I guess maybe a slight potentially a slight maybe challenge to like how you can still be very successful maybe and still have a low view of philosophy, but I guess maybe it's interesting to think of maybe how much farther it could have went too with with a more expansive view.
Well, when people make assertions, it doesn't always reflect their own dispositions to behave.
Right.
So someone like E.O. Wills, not everyone has perfect knowledge of themselves. I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but okay, if you know what I'm saying. Okay.
Yeah.
And I think Wilson's a good example of this. Wilson's an excellent scientist. And I think one of the reasons he is he has a very philosophical mind.
Right.
He has a keen philosophical mind. And this is one of the things, he may not be aware of this and he may not understand it, but that doesn't mean it isn't true.
Yeah.
And just because he disavows it, wrongly, I think, doesn't mean he doesn't instantiate the very thing he's disavowing. I think he does. And so I think this is just part of a real marketing and PR problem that philosophy has in the contemporary world. We need to explain to people more than ever. You look at all the fake news and the politicization of truth. It's crazy. I mean, as an epistemologist, it's absolutely terrifying because what we're losing is common epistemic standards, common standards for discourse and belief and knowledge. If you lose that, you got nothing.
Yeah.
You just got nothing. And so philosophy now more than ever is important, both to science and to common sense and to political discourse and to just ordinary discourse. Yeah. It's crucial.
Well, yeah, I mean, about like how like public intellectuals also are like either trained in philosophy or are self-described philosophers, and that's not. Yeah, it doesn't seem like that's a coincidence because you're like literally trained in like how to think. So,
well, right. I mean,
it doesn't mean all philosophers are right, but just like they build the skills for that. Yeah.
Yes, and one of the things I think that's happened recently is technology has gotten out ahead of us. We're just playing catch up now with a lot of the technology, social media and other things especially. I think philosophers are really needed now to step back and look at the big picture and the whole system and say, does this make sense? What we're doing to ourselves? What are we doing? And does it make any sense? Is it rational? Is it something we should continue to do? And these kinds of big picture normative questions, that's what philosophers have been doing forever, and that's what we're trained to do. And as I said, I think more than ever, both in science and just in ordinary life.
Yeah. Which I think is also like one reason why it's been fun to do the Philosophy Friday series is kind of having some sort of cross like describing things using like how far like one can go just describing their philosophical ideas using ants. Which actually like I did want to ask you a question about so I saw like looking through like some of your work that you've both published in and with co-authors, and then also have a book I think you're working on coherence. And I was sort of curious about like what exactly coherence is and why it's important. And then I have another follow-up question that's kind of potentially pulling in some ants into it.
Yeah. So coherence. Well, so this relates to rationality. So look, there's some things are true and some things are false, and some things we're in a position to know and some things we're not. And I think the difficult cases, and so the difficult cases, I think, are cases in which there are certain things we're just not in a position to know. And now the question is, are there rules that govern belief and so on, even in cases where you're not in a position to know? Because you might think, well, all that matters is knowledge.
And I assume when you mean rules, you mean like just completely objective, like outside of human experience, like rules.
I mean principles of rational thinking that apply rightfully to agents, even when they're not in a position to know the relevant facts.
I see.
So maybe a good way to think about the kind of stuff I work on, and a way to get into it, is to think about an example. So suppose you buy a lottery ticket, and it's a big lottery. It's a huge lottery. And there's exactly one winner. Each ticket's equally likely to win, and each one is very unlikely to win. And so now I ask you, do you think your ticket is going to lose? And I think the reasonable thing to say is, yeah, it's going to lose.
Right.
Now, however, that's true for any ticket. It doesn't matter which ticket you happen to purchase. It would have been reasonable for you to say, yeah, my ticket's going to lose. That's not an unreasonable or irrational belief. But that means it's reasonable to be such that for each ticket, you believe of that ticket that it's not going to win. But you know some ticket's going to win.
Right, right.
So now you've got an inconsistent set of beliefs. You have a set of beliefs that cannot all be true.
Right, right.
No matter how the world turns out.
Like, you can't believe that every individual ticket is going to lose and that one ticket wins, right?
You can. No, you can.
Oh, sorry.
And in fact,
that's right.
And I think it's fully reasonable to do so. But what I'm trying to point out is, being rational, the question of which beliefs are reasonable is not just a question of what you know. It's much more subtle than that. It's more like, what does your evidence support? Well, in fact, your evidence does support the claim that your ticket will lose, no matter which ticket you have. And it also supports the claim that some ticket will win. So here we have a very interesting situation where you're following your evidence, and it leads you into an inconsistent set of beliefs, a set of beliefs such that one of them's got to be wrong.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think this is the kind of question I'm interested in, because on the one hand, that seems like a very rational set of beliefs. You're just following your evidence in each case. On the other hand, you know a priori that some of them have to be false.
Yeah, yeah.
Now that's an uncomfortable position to be in, but this is the kind of question I'm interested in.
Yeah. Because sorry,
yeah. No, I was just going to say, this kind of question about the nature of reasonable or rational belief, that's the kind of question I'm interested in. And so that has to do with, from your perspective, given your evidence, what would be reasonable to believe, given that you don't know everything. Right? Of course, if you knew everything, you would just believe what you know, and then you'd be done. But we don't know everything. In fact, we know relatively little. And so we're often in these situations where rationality or reasonableness leads us into a kind of a strange collection of beliefs. That's the kind of stuff that I'm primarily interested in. And so coherence has to do with how all of your beliefs hang together. In the case I just described, there's a sense in which the beliefs seem incoherent. After all, they're inconsistent logically. They can't all be true.
Right.
That's a sense in which beliefs could be incoherent. But I don't think that's the kind of coherence that rationality involves. I think rationality permits sometimes inconsistent beliefs. And so I think the way rational coherence works, it's actually weaker. It's less demanding than the requirements of logic.
Interesting.
It's more about probability. If your belief is probable enough, given your evidence, well, then it's reasonable. And that is going to contradict the laws of deductive logic.
Right.
In just a very simple case, I mean, lotteries happen all the time. This isn't some weird case. This is just a thing that happens all the time. And so that's the kind of thing. And so coherence, it's got to be more than just what logic tells you, whether things are consistent with each other. It's how they hang together. And I would say it's more how they hang together with your evidence. How do they line up with your evidence? And so now you need some kind of account of how evidence works. And for me, that's where probability comes in.
Right, yeah. So I think this might be another example. Well, it was one. It may be similar to the lottery ticket example, but it was one of the executive producers, Lauren Layden Hardy, wanted me to ask, which was to please explain Dutch books, which I understand are not actually just books that are about Dutch, using bets about ant races.
Using bets about ant races. Okay.
Yes.
Well. So Dutch books, I mean, there's a lot of different things that word, a lot of different ways in which it's used. I prefer the term money pump. Okay, so that's a broader class of arguments. So these money pump arguments, also called Dutch books, but I don't like that. First of all, I love the Dutch, and I'm not sure what the implication is.
Yeah, maybe it's slightly derogatory.
I just don't get it. I never really figured out, is it good to be a Dutch bookie, or is it bad? I mean, you're ripping people off, but they kind of deserve it because they're incoherent. So I don't know. But anyway, setting that aside, let's just talk about money pump arguments. And there's a lot of different kinds of money pump arguments. But basically, these are arguments that what they aim to show is that if your beliefs or your degrees of belief, right, if your attitude towards the world violate certain coherence requirements, then we'll be able to put you in a system of bets where you're guaranteed to lose money.
I see.
Right. So an example of this, let's take a very trivial example. Let's just take a very simple example. It's a law of probability that you should assign a maximal confidence to any claim that, say, is necessarily true, is a logical truth.
Right.
So, for instance, take the claim. So let's suppose I got an ant named John, and I don't know how ant races work. Are they individual things, or is it a team race? Is it like a?
That's a good question. Like I suppose probably the most relevant thing would probably, I guess in this case, just be an individual. That would depend on the colony if it was following each other. But for the purpose of the example, you can split an individual.
Yeah, well, it doesn't really matter. I'm just giving a very simple example to illustrate, so it won't matter. But let's suppose take the claim John will win the race. Okay, here's a claim. Either John will win the race or John will not win the race.
Right.
Okay. Now, suppose you're not maximally confident in that. You assign a 90% confidence to that. You should assign 100% confidence, obviously, because it has to be true.
Right.
Now, suppose you only assign a 90% confidence. Well, then, if I set up a bet, if I ask you to bet on the outcome of the race, okay, but you're betting on the truth of either he'll win or he won't, right?
Right.
So now I'll offer you a bet that seems to be a fair bet, but of course I'm going to make 10 cents from you every time.
Right.
Because you're betting at 90% odds on a sure thing.
Yeah. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, right. Yeah.
You're betting at 90% odds on a thing that is just necessarily by logic a sure thing.
Yeah.
So I can easily pump you for money, and that's the basic idea. So that's one of the coherence requirements, that you be maximally confident in things that have to be true, and you be minimally confident in things that must be false. That's one of the laws of probability that we think is a coherence requirement on belief. And if you violate that, it's very easy to set up a bet that you're just going to lose money, right?
Interesting.
And there are other laws of probability, and you can give similar kinds of arguments that if you violate those, that I'll be able to set up a system of bets where you're guaranteed to lose money. Bets that should be acceptable to you, because given your betting odds. So if you think if it's betting odds are 0.9, well, then I offer you a bet at those odds, and you should view that as an even bet.
Right.
But I know that it's a sure thing, so I'm going to win 10 cents off you every time. Suppose I just offer you a $1 bet.
Right.
I'm just going to keep siphoning you forever, because you're not confident enough in things that we know are going to happen.
So outside, I just wanted to try to put a little bit of the ants into coherence, but I was wondering if how exactly is the situation with the money pump, you said, right? Was that the broad term? How often does that happen? What's the relevance of that example to the kind of concepts of coherence, or is it just kind of just a way of just illustrating the importance of probabilistic thinking, or basically what's the utility of it to the sort of, I guess, philosophical discussion of coherence?
Well, the money pump arguments are meant to be arguments in support of the claim that these laws of probability really are rational requirements. That if you violate them, then you're irrational, and your irrationality is exhibited by the fact that I can just pump you for money by giving you bets that you view as fair.
So basically, the idea is if it wasn't rational, if it wasn't rational, then if it was rational, then there'd be no way that someone could game you, basically. And do you think that applies to all cases of rationality? Are there any cases of rationality where if you could be rational and you could be true that they could be completely rational and someone could also game it, or is that just a logical impossibility? Maybe it is. Well,
there are many different conceptions of rationality, and so that's a kind of pragmatic conception of rationality because it relates to betting behavior.
It's an outcome.
It's typically thought that this is it's a sure sign of pragmatic irrationality. if I can pump you for money just by giving you bets that you view as fair,
right,
that are fair by your own lights. Yeah, that's bad.
Yeah.
But that's just one notion of coherence, the pragmatic notion. I think what would be more relevant to the case of the ants is just a epistemological notion of coherence, more like the kind that I was talking about with the lottery case, because that's just pure epistemology. It's about what your evidence supports and what's true and what you know. It's not about betting. It's not about money. It's not about anything pragmatic.
Right.
Because I'm really interested in epistemology. So I think the case of the ants, one thing that comes to mind there is if you just forget about ants for a second, just first think about a group of people. And suppose you have a bunch of people and they have a bunch of opinions about a bunch of stuff, and you want to sort of aggregate their individual opinions into what you might call a consensus judgment.
Right.
For instance, you might have a committee that is required to render a verdict on a certain question, and what they need to do is take votes from people, and then they need to combine the votes somehow to come up with a consensus verdict or a consensus answer to the question. And so that's a notion of group belief. If you take individual beliefs and you try to aggregate them, what you're looking to do is construct a group belief out of the individuals that comprise the group. And there's a lot of work on that. That's something that I've worked on. So there's a lot of work in epistemology about aggregating.
I think there was even one contribution earlier in the Falsity Friday series that addressed this issue. Yeah, like I've used like if they're like a committee like deciding something, and and how that might differ from kind of like an additive form of decision making. That's right. So ants, it's a little tricky to attribute beliefs to them, although you might. But it's hard to elicit those beliefs. So a better way maybe to think about this kind of cases, instead of thinking about aggregating beliefs, think about aggregating preferences. So you've got a bunch of people and each of them has their own preferences, and you want to aggregate them, say, to form a group preference. There's a famous result in economics called Arrow's theorem. Ken Arrow proved this in the 50s, and he won the Nobel Prize for it. And what Arrow showed is that given some very plausible assumptions about how that aggregation process works, there's basically no good way to do it. Pretty much you're bound to end up with what is like essentially nope. You're bound to. I mean, Arrow's result basically is that given pretty weak assumptions, you're bound to end up with a dictatorship. Essentially, you're bound to end up with a set of preferences that just corresponds to the preferences of one of the individuals in the group. Oh, interesting.
And that's unfortunate because you might have thought that you'd want something other than that. You might think democracy is all about not having a dictator.
Right.
But it turns out, very weak assumptions about aggregating people's preferences lead to this weird result. So that's that's one of the early results in formal epistemology, broadly construed now because it's about preference. But that's one of the most famous impossibility results in formal epistemology, having to do with aggregation.
Does that apply? So it's interesting because I think of the way that basic decision making is done by in colonies with ants. Let's say it's always considered as being sort of not directional or not directed. Like there's not like any one ant that's like deciding like what to do. But like the kind of standard aggregation decision making process is pretty kind of just probabilistic of just like it happens to be like this far away, so like the chemical is like stronger, and so like that's the one that gets reinforced because there's a higher chance that like a stronger trail will be encountered by more ants or whatever. But so do you think then that sort of result in economics could be applied to even the idea that like one ant's I guess it would only work if there is preferences among individual ants for making different decisions. Then it would actually end up just coming down to like the decision of one ant or something, or is there some fundamental difference between these systems where you wouldn't be able to apply it?
Well, that's a really interesting question. So one thing that would be interesting to look at is look at the assumptions that underlie Arrow's theorem. And, those assumptions can be questioned. And in some contexts, those assumptions, don't hold. My guess is that ants exhibit a certain kind of coherence or a certain kind of togetherness that might violate some of the assumptions that Arrow makes about how you put their preferences together, or maybe Arrow's theorem is compatible with this because maybe all the ants actually share the very same preferences, so they are a dictatorship.
Yeah, which would be
That's a
kind of
trivial. That's
interesting.
just a degenerate case of Arrow's theorem. Of course, it's still true in that case where they all share the same preferences that it's a dictatorship in Arrow's sense because there exists one member such that the preferences exactly line up with theirs. Happens to be everyone has the same.
Yeah.
That's a degenerate case of Arrow's theorem. So it might just
Interesting.
be that there's a very boring way that this is compatible with Arrow's theorem. That just really, when you try to look at preferences of ants, you can't do it. Ants in a colony, they just have the same preferences.
Although it is interesting because my understanding of the ant literature, the mimicological literature on this topic is that actually even within a single colony, there actually is a variation in sort of preferences, even on the level of just like how kind of what we might call brave or sort of exploratory they are, how like how they might react to different like say like a more sugary, more salty like substance, that sort of thing, and just whatever given state of the ant at the time when it encounters a resource would probably have a different preference than it's like one of its sisters. So like that's
that's interesting. Then it would
so
really
I wonder if it does fit.
question. Yeah. I wonder if anyone's done this. It's an obvious thing to try. That is to look at the collective behavior and see if you can think of it as being aggregated out of the individual ant behavior, or how that relates to Arrow's theorem. Does Arrow's theorem apply in the case? If so, it kind of makes it impossible. If not, maybe it gives a way to get around Arrow's theorem, and that would be an interesting thing to know about. I wonder if anyone's done that. I mean, that seems to me to be one of the places you could have an interesting analogy because it involves coherence, and it involves the coherence of a group as a function of, let's say, the coherence of the individual members of the group. And those are questions that I've worked on when it's humans. I've worked on the aggregation of judgment and preference.
Less interesting than ants, but still pretty interesting. So,
yeah. I think that's a place where could be a really fascinating theoretical connection. I haven't personally looked at, but I bet there's some really cool stuff there to look at in terms of collective behavior and how it supervenes or how it reduces to the behavior of the individuals.
Yeah, I mean, maybe they also look at the assumptions of Arrow's theorem to see if they because it's possible maybe some of the ones directly don't apply or something, but it still could be pretty interesting, especially because there is a prevailing kind of assumption that that behavior works in a certain kind of reduced way or kind of simplistic way that's already in other ways is getting kind of is getting sort of challenged a bit. Like, even though they learning that there actually is some chemical transfer that might actually be communicative via like orally and like not just trail laying and other sort of things. And so it's like this could be a whole other layer of like of like maybe it's not as collective as is thought. It could be interesting.
Right, and you could also apply kind of measures of coherence to the group. You could try that. There's different ways you could measure how coherent the group is.
And
you could just one naive
compare it to, yeah.
Well, one naive way to do it would be to just look at the preferences of each individual member of the group, and then just have some naive distance measure between them. And then here's one measure of coherence. It's like the average distance between the preference orderings of the members of the group.
Right. Yeah.
That's formal epistemology, baby. Feels good, doesn't it?
Like
you're doing it right now.
Pretty straightforward to implement actually in terms of like preference. Like I think they're actually using some preference kind of things. Studies that are done quite somewhat like that, but not oriented towards testing these sort of formal theories. I think.
Right. But you see, the great thing about formal tools is they have a kind of generality. They have a kind of universality that they really can apply to lots of different systems. That's kind of cool. That's one of the things I really like about it.
Yeah, I guess I'll just have to change my dissertation in my fourth year. One, I guess actually it's amazing. We've actually been talking for quite a while. I did have a couple of sort of more kind of on the sillier side of things, although I still think they're quite serious. But quick questions about ants, which I was wondering, one, what your favorite thing about ants is?
My favorite thing about ants is how they work together, is their collective behavior, that there's a social purpose. And I think that's very important. I think it's something kind of lacking in America, especially in modern America. And I think that's not a good thing. Yeah. So I like ants because they work together toward a common purpose.
Which, I of course agree. I think, really if we were more like ants in many ways, it'd be good. Except for, I guess maybe we'd lose some freedom. But although who knows, maybe it'll turn out that ants are more freedom than they think, and that freedom is not necessarily the number one ethical concern either. Potentially.
Yes. Of course there are trade-offs, but I think one thing that is lacking in modern human society is a common purpose and a common ground. And I think that would really help having more of that.
Yeah, actually, and even in some ant species, you actually can find the ones that there can be antagonistic interactions even within a colony for like reproduction and everything. Although maybe those are the more derivative humanoid type of ants, but it actually is a thing in some species. So.
Right. I mean, I'm just saying that's my favorite thing about ants.
Right. Of course, there's a whole ton of other things. Yeah. And then what do you I guess beyond what we already talked about, maybe this is what we talked about, but what do you think ants could contribute to philosophy, or do you think it'd be beneficial if philosophers used ants as examples more often?
I mean, I don't know. I guess I don't know enough about ants to really speak to that. No, I would need to study ants more. They're fascinating, and there is a lot of interesting stuff, especially about their collective behavior that I've read a little bit about, but I don't know very much about ants. And so it's hard for me to say, but I should probably just read up more on ants, and then I could come up with a good example. I don't really know enough about them.
I mean, I imagine I hope maybe it's not too late to include an ant example in a coher-ants, but in your book that's not quite depressed yet, I think, right? So
no, I'm still working on it. I could try.
Yeah.
It's a good homework assignment. I have to study it more, but I have thought about it in terms of collective behavior.
Yeah.
So I have thought about that, and I thought about, hey, they seem to have very strong and successful collective behavior. Human beings, not so much, and there are these impossibility results and so on. And it feels like that's interesting, and to me that's a very interesting difference between the two species. And I'd like to know more about that. And then if I could learn more about that, I could probably come up with some good examples. I love examples, so any example that's that gets the point across, I think is good.
Yeah. And that's what they do. That's kind of nice about ants is that they're also like universal and they kind of like dominant in many different cultures. Whatnot. So they do, I think, often. Even though, of course, I love them personally and everything, but there's among some other organisms too. But they have this kind of nice, maybe not full universality, but pretty close. As an example. Because pretty much everyone has, when they're a kid, no matter where they're from, always seen the ant, so and kind of observed it at some point, at some level.
Yes. Oh yeah. No, everybody knows about ants. Like I said, I lived in California, and so there are a lot of ants out there.
Right. Which is why California's a blessed state. So.
Yes, and I became much more familiar with ant behavior when I as a homeowner in Northern California, and that was very interesting. I mean, they're super clever, and they're very persistent, and they really work together in very surprising ways. And in a way, I really admire them. They were kind of a nuisance to me personally, but I should. But like I said, I should study them more because they're fascinating, especially the collective aspects of the behavior. I find that really fascinating. So I'm strongly in favor of ant examples. I mean, the ant examples are great.
How could you be against it? Yeah. I guess we've been talking for a while, so we should like wrap it up. Even though I could feel like I could talk all day. But
this is super fun. I'm enjoying it.
Yeah. One thing I actually forgot to I meant to open with it was something else like Lauren wanted me to make sure to say, which was to also apologize for the Daily Ant Mafia cornering you in St. Louis after you judiciously declined the initial invitation to contribute to Philosophy Fridays. I'm glad that you came around, but sorry it took a little bit of pressuring.
No, it didn't. I was going to do it.
Oh,
I love doing it.
Good.
Oh my gosh. I love doing it. This is fantastic. Yeah. Me say no to a chance to talk?
Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah, yeah. Maybe the original input was to do a written contribution, but I guess like talking about it is maybe even easier. So.
Oh yeah, I'm not a big fan of the writing. No, I'd much rather. I mean, yeah.
You do philosophers and do philosophy, and philosophers never write anything. So.
Well, look, writing is great, but I'm more of a oral, verbal tradition kind of guy.
Yeah.
I like to talk, so it's super fun.
Well, actually, I think it does assist, like what you were saying earlier, by also having it, more understanding, especially among scientists, a more kind of real understanding of what philosophy actually is, and not kind of like a boogeyman version. But yeah,
that's right. And I think it's very, I say, in my experience, I just find it much more effective to sit down with a person, and listen to what they're doing and try to understand what they're doing, and try to explain to them what you're doing. This is, in my experience, way more effective than trying to exchange written ideas. It just, maybe it's because I'm a people person, I love people, but I really just get much more out of talking to people, whether it's a seminar or a conference or whatever. I learn way more that way than I do by reading.
Interesting, yeah. Actually, I think overall, even though I actually really enjoy talking quite a bit, as anyone who knows me can attest. But I actually just really remember it. So I often find, I think, like reading it and being able to kind of go back to it is potentially more beneficial. But I wonder what actually influences my beliefs more may end up being actually the oral communication.
Well, sure, you've got to work at all the details, and it's always good to be able to, but in terms of just getting a basic understanding of what someone's doing,
right, yeah,
nothing better than talking.
Really the most effective. Yeah.
And I don't think there'll ever be anything better than talking to a person to understand them and what they're doing.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a pretty uplifting note at the end. And also I wanted to thank you for speaking the same week as Thanksgiving, and I wanted to wish you a very happy Thanksgiving to you and Tina from all of us here at the Daily Ant.
Well, happy Thanksgiving to you, and thanks again for the opportunity to talk. It's been a great pleasure.
Yeah, I think I understand more about what your work is. I was a little bit uncertain reading some of the abstract stuff, but yeah, as you say, speaking has conferred a lot of clarity.
Oh, that's excellent.
Yeah. So thank you very much, and I guess I'll see you at some point. I don't know if you'll be at the Central APA, but I'm in Chicago, so that's
well, I'll be at the Pacific and the Eastern this year.
Okay, fine.
Sorry, but I will, of course, be in Chicago at some point in the next year, I'm sure. So I will definitely make sure to look you up when I'm there.
And I'd be very happy to give you a tour of the Fuel Museum, which is where my lab is. I could show you some of the ants and stuff. So they're all dead.
Oh, that would be awesome. See, an opportunity for me to learn more about ants, which I need.
Yeah, there you go. So yeah, like definitely just shoot me an email.
Fantastic. You take care. Thanks so much.
You too. Yeah.